Hi, everybody. How are you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian.
I'm Jerry Harvey.
This is Jerry.
Nice to meet you.
So I figured that we'd talk, just do Q&A with me and Jerry for a bit, but feel free to jump in with questions anytime you want. And we'll talk for maybe about a half hour or so, and then we can do some questions at the end. You can talk about, ask anything you want about Ultimate Ears, about JH Audio, about audio technology, anything like that. So we'll cover it all from the beginning to now.
Cool. Ready to
Cool.
go. Yeah,
Ready
and
to rock?
also make sure everyone gets a raffle ticket. We're giving away a set of Roxanne, so make sure you get your ticket in there for that at the end.
Yeah, and afterwards also for the whole day we'll be demoing, or Dr. Glick, who's in the back there, will be demoing all the models of JH, so you can listen to them, and they all sound amazing, even if you're not a rock star. So please enjoy. So I thought we'd start by just talking about how this story begins. So you're a guy who wasn't a musician and had no connections to this business, and somehow got wrapped up with a bunch of guys from Van Halen and Sammy Hagar, and sort of got you sort of mixed into this business. So maybe just talk about how that started and how you went from a guy who just likes music to a guy who became indispensable to these guys.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I met a guy named Roger Moore, and he had a little local band. I was teaching karate to him, right, as a side thing, so I could have my free lessons. But anyway, he had this band, and I wanted to get into the bar. I was underage, so I thought if I could move gear in, that I could get into the bar without having to have an ID. So that's kind of how it started. And then I learned, I had learned to mix kind of by trial and error. I was really bad for the first few years, and people were not shy to tell me that. But so anyway, I was mixing, and I had a couple mentors, and I started to get fairly, get pretty good at it. And I was driving down the road, and it's kind of weird that Van Halen just kind of intertwined into my life just out of the blue. I was driving down the road. I was had a red Trans Am. I was like 1980, right? And I get pulled over, and this guy was a promoter rep for Contemporary Productions. He says, "Hey, Sammy Hagar's playing Busch Stadium on Saturday, and we need him to drive your car out onto stage because he's got a song called Trans Am, right?" So I was like, all right, whatever, I want to get into the show, so I'll go down.
Sounds
there.
legit.
Yeah, so he showed me his card, so I was like, yeah, I'll show up. So I showed up, they let me in, and they go, well, we're going to introduce you to Sammy Hagar. I was like, all right, great, and so I walk up, and I go, hi, I'm Jerry. He goes, hi, I'm Sammy, and basically kind of dismissed me a little bit. Hey, thanks for letting me use your car, and I'll get out of here, kid, So he drives it out on the stage, and it kind of became like a little bit of an urban legend in St. Louis, right? But so that was kind of my first introduction, and I saw the Big Rock show, and I saw, realized that if I got really good at mixing, maybe I could get to that level someday. So fast forward to like 1984, I'm sitting in, and kind of got discouraged. I'll keep this short if I can. And I was going to just start doing a normal day gig because the bands weren't paying any money. I was starving to death, and I went and saw the Van Halen 1984 show. They played 2 nights, so at the end of the show, I was just blown away. I was like, I think I want to do sound engineering again. And so I'm sitting at this little bar called Bogart's on the Landing on the riverfront. And I look to my left, and David Lee Roth sits down right next to me, right? And I was like, wow, so we sit down, and I start talking to him about how, martial arts and stretching. I never even said a word to him about rock and roll, even though I wanted to go. Yeah, I knew who he was, absolutely. I just saw him on stage. I actually wanted to ask him for a job, but I didn't, right? But so 18 months later, I'm actually working for him because I met a gentleman that was a drum tech for him, and he was with the Beach Boys. And when Dave left Van Halen, he introduced me to the Dave camp, and I ended up 18 months later working for Dave. So it's kind of a weird thing, right? So this is like 1986 or so for the Eat 'Em and Smile tour and Skyscraper. And then in 95, I start working for Van Halen, right? So I'm working for Dave, I'm working for Van Halen. Neither know that I'm working for the other because I didn't want to get fired. So, so that's kind of how it kind of just intertwined. And then in 95, when I was working for Van Halen, we decided to put Alex on in-ears, and that's kind of how Ultimate Ears started.
So basically, so I hear the story is that, so Alex and Eddie came to you and said, we're basically going deaf. What do we do, right?
Yeah, well,
And this is what happens. Right?
Alex was going deaf because he had Eddie's guitar cabinet blaring behind him. He had these 2 big PA systems behind him, so he was just getting killed with volume, and it sounded really bad out front because all this stuff is going through the drum mics. And So in-ear monitors, was in its infancy, and people were focusing more on the transmitters and receivers than they were the earphone side of it. So they wanted to save the rest of Alex's hearing, so we decided to try to put him on in-ear monitors. Well, it didn't go so well because he's, even though he had some, he'd been around loud music, the guy's got an amazing ear and he can hear tonality and everything else. So as soon as there was 2 companies back then that in the beginning had started putting basically either a balanced armature in a silicone mold or basically a Sony diaphragm in a mold, and called them, in-ear monitors. So we get him a set of each, and he listens to the first set, plays about four beats, takes them out, throws them down, puts a second set in, plays about 4 beats, and goes, these things sound horrible. He goes, I suggest we find something better. And I said, well, they don't make anything better. And he goes, well, maybe you should figure out how to make something better. Then he gets up and walks off his drum kit. So that's kind of how I started down the path. I never.
It all comes back to Van Halen.
Yeah, I didn't want to build anything. I never thought about it, but it was just, I was kind of instructed, to do it, and I wanted to keep my gig. So, I decided I was going to build something that sounded better.
So so I think the story is that there was nothing that was better. So you had to figure out how to make something. So you used parts from, we can describe it, you used parts from like a pacemaker and parts from a hearing aid, and somehow jury rigged this stuff up to work. It was somehow better than everything else out there, which is amazing.
Well, I realized, by starting to experiment with the components, that one component couldn't do the complete frequency response from lows to high. You could have, with the balanced armature, it was kind of a hearing aid driver, basically a hot-rodded hearing aid speaker. You could get good lows, not lows, but low mids, and highs, but no real sub bass. And then with the diaphragm speaker that's in a Sony bud, you get nice lows, but you couldn't get any top end extension. So I realized that, looking up at the PA system, it wasn't rocket science. I was like, well, we've been putting multiple, lows, mids, and highs with crossovers in big speakers. Why can't we do it in a miniature earphone? So I started just researching and trying to find miniature components, and landed a gentleman named Rick Zanardo at a company called Knowles, became my liaison, and he was sending me samples. I would put them on the analyzer it was modeling clay and an analyzer mic, and shoot pink noise through it and see what the frequency response was. So I found a driver that was suitable for mids and highs, but I couldn't find a driver that had the capacity for live performance for low frequency reproduction. So I get a call from Rick. He goes, hey, I found this thing in the armature cemetery. He goes, it's a pacemaker speaker. He goes, what it's for is if someone has a pacemaker, it has to emit 140 dB tone or 130 dB tone through their chest to let them know that they're going to get a zap, so they might want to sit down, right? So I was like, cool, send it to me. So I shoot pink noise through it, and all of a sudden I'm like, wow, this thing's a perfect bass driver, right? So then I made a little crossover and popped him into Alex's ears. He smiled, and I was like, wow, so that's kind of how that just, it was just trial and error, and, a lucky call from Rick, and that's kind of how it all came together. And that was the first UE5, the first two-way in-ear monitor.
So I guess the next question is, so how do you go from a guy who has sort of thrown this together from the graveyard of hearing aid parts to someone who all the rock stars are coming and begging for products? So they say that Sebastian Bach came begging you with cash, said, give me as many as you can, and Engelbert Humperdinck, and everyone's coming and begging. So what do you do? So you have to mass produce these. What happens?
Well, it was kind of funny. Skid Row was open for Van Halen. They saw Alex was happy, and they had the other models, and they weren't happy. So I built them 6 sets of in-ear monitors. They asked me if I could do it. I go, yeah, I'll build you 6 sets. And I'd never sold anything. It wasn't a company. And I walk into the production office, and the tour manager goes, well, how much do I owe you? I was like, well, $500 a pair. So he hands me $3,000, right? And I was like, this is like 3 weeks' work. I was like, this is a lot more profitable than actually mixing for a living. So that's when I decided to do Ultimate Ears. But what happened was, Westone was the company that did the shells for me, because I had no concept of how to mold it, but I did all the audio circuits. So there's a couple of good guys at Westone that I became very good friends with, Carl and Chris Cartwright. And so I told them, I said, I'm going to start a company. Will you guys be my OEM? And they're like, yeah, we'll build them for you. So I basically became the design and the marketing side of Ultimate Ears, and then they were my OEM. They would do the manufacturing for me. So that's how we kept up with production, is I had to outsource it because I didn't have the capability to do any of the molding or anything.
And so at some point then you decide to split with Westone and start manufacturing on your own. So again, so when you're in a situation as a small business owner where all of a sudden you...
Oh, am I sucking here? 2-2? Okay, sorry.
Where all of a sudden you can't interrupt your business, but you have to start doing things you haven't done before. So how do you just out of nowhere learn to manufacture the shells as well without interrupting your business?
Well, what I did is we were having kind of a little divorce situation going on between Westone and myself, and the president told me, we can't really divorce because you don't know how to build the product. So, you're going to just kind of have to toe the line and do this. So I decided to go to Florida and learn how to build hearing aids. And I went to a place called Electone, and I stayed there for 2 weeks trying to learn how to build shells and to do hearing aid fabrication, and realized that I was not going to be able to get the skill set within 2 weeks to start my own lab. So I hired the instructor, and I said, hey, if I double your salary, will you come to Vegas and start a lab with me? And he said, yeah, no problem. So he shows up. I bought all this equipment, and he's like, you bought all the stuff that's wrong, So I was like, great. And I had a little light to make shells. It was about 6 inches by 6 inches, and he called it the Barbie tanning bed. He goes, I can't make earpieces with Barbie tanning bed. So we revamped, and we continued to let Westone manufacture, and then we basically developed the process that now is kind of what all of the companies are doing as far as the ultraviolet cure shells, So we figured it out. We built the first 100, we decided, okay, now we're ready to go. So started building all the stuff in-house. So the first 100 pair I built, I rebuilt them maybe 4 times, and my customers were really, cool, because I was telling them, well, I'm trying to learn how to build this. They would fail, and they'd send them back. So, but within about 90 days, we had the process down, and everybody supported us out in the pro market. So, that's how Ultimate Ears, that's how my manufacturing side got started, out of necessity.
And so so during this whole process, you're still mixing for bands. So you were mixing for Kiss and for all these bands. And I've heard some interesting stories about, one of them that I read was about how you had some interesting shouting matches with Gene Simmons, where he thought he was shouting at you, but it turns out you may not have been there.
Yeah, in Gene's defense, the equipment back then was not really good, and maybe I didn't have the chops either. But we had some monumental, historic, squabbles back and forth, kind of like a husband and wife. But we were in a truck stop one night, and I look over, and there's this cardboard cutout full size of a Big Daddy Don Garless. He's holding a Kindle oil can, right? So I said, I'm going to steal that. So I stole it. I took it, and I put it on the bus. And from that point on, I put a Kiss T-shirt on it, and then I put a bunch of scruff on it because I was so miserable on that tour that I wouldn't shave. So I kind of made it look like me. I put a Kiss hat on it. And we always had this scrim in front of us. It was like a black mesh scrim, but I had to have a light on my face so Gene could see my face when he was, as you could say, maybe talking to me. So every time I would get upset with Gene, I would tell my third man, give me Big Daddy. So what I would do is I would take the cardboard cutout and I'd put it behind the mixing console, and I'd walk off and take a breather and not be mad anymore. And when I'd cool down, I'd come back. Well, that might be 4 or 5 songs. And then Gene would come over and start yelling at the cardboard cutout. And everybody on stage knew about it, but he didn't, right? So it got to be kind of a running joke, and we'd put him up there more than... Actually, I think that the cardboard cutout probably made more money than I did on that tour after that, So that's kind of the Big Daddy story.
Cool. So I want to talk a bit about JH, but before that, I want to talk about how you realize, okay, well, you're selling these really high-end units to rock stars that cost a lot of money. They're very highly customized. At some point, you realize that everyone's running around listening to really bad earphones, and there's an opportunity there for consumer too. So I want to talk about what it takes for someone who's used to making $1,000 units, $2,000 units. What do you do when you decide, okay, I want to make things for a market that can't afford to spend more than $100 or $200, and how that happens, how you become a company that's split between pro and sort of the lower end consumer.
Obviously that change came about with the iPod, because before the iPod, people would buy $60, $100 CD players, and no one wanted to spend more than $50 for a set of Sony Buds. 2003, I was mixing the Linkin Park guys, and the production assistant walks up and hands me an iPod. I was like, what is this thing? And so she explains that there's a bunch of songs on it, and I put my earpieces in, and I listen. I go, it's pretty good fit. The earpieces sound good with the player. So I quit the tour, came back because the lab's going, so I'm still touring with bands and stuff. So I quit the tour to come back and start like a consumer division, and it was an interesting experience because these forums that just started, like HeadFi and all of that, and went out and spoke to Apple at the time because they were iPod, and they gave us some support. But we actually grew. I think in 3 years we grew 1,000% just off of the consumers. So I ended up having to build a lower cost unit that the consumers would buy. And what's kind of crazy now is it's shifted. The consumers are more interested in the high-end stuff, especially Southeast Asian people that really appreciate the audio quality. So in the beginning we thought we had to really build these low cost earpieces, and now today everybody's used to buying more top shelf stuff than the more reasonably priced stuff.
And is the technology moving down from the really high end? Is it getting cheaper to manufacture so you can put really high end equipment, or are the costs pretty much staying the same?
The costs are staying the same because the companies that build the components they know they have a monopoly. Even though I have them designed, I design them and I have them built to my specs, they still know they're the only game in town. There's only two companies that build the components, so they've kept the cost of the components high. So it's really kind of hard to get anything really, really cheap. I don't think you'll ever see a $100 multi-driver earpiece until they decide they want to increase volume versus profit margin.
And so that was sort of the next question. So how is it that the two companies that you founded, JH and Ultimate Ears, are the companies that everyone goes to? Why is nobody else able to break into this market? Is it because of you? Because the components are just, you've locked up the market, or why can no one else compete here?
Well, I'd like to say it was me, but I think, but no, it's not. Ultimate Ears is just a brand that's been around since 1995, so people know the brand. All of the components that I use inside my earphones are built to my spec, so they're not off-the-shelf components. They may have the same can size as what anybody can buy and put into a shell, but they're all to my spec, my impedance curves. So I think that Ultimate Ears, when I was there, and Jerry Harvey Audio now, I think it's more of the audio signature and performance that keeps people coming back to us. It's really easy now to learn how to build a mold and put a bunch of components in it, but it's getting those components tuned and in phase and to play correctly with each other that actually, the end result is better if you know what you're doing. I'm not saying that I'm not the only person who knows that, but I think the end user, when they compare A, B, C, and D, when they listen, they can actually hear kind of the audio signature that I think is pleasing to most people.
So let's then talk about JH Audio then. So you sell Ultimate Ears and you decide to start out on your own again. And so what's different this time? So you're again starting out from zero, and you have this big user base. And
I didn't sell Ultimate Ears. I kind of was on the backside of that. Watch venture capital, and I'll leave it at that. But so we started Jerry Harvey Audio, JH Audio, and I had a little bit of a break period because I had a non-compete. But I wasn't done designing the earphones. I had designs I'd been working on for that 2-year period that I wanted to get out into the marketplace. So for me, JH Audio is just a continuation of Ultimate Ears, and just gives me a platform to keep designing products and trying to push the technology forward.
And so what are you doing differently now? So you've been in this business for a long time, and so you're releasing things like Roxanne, which no one's ever seen before. So what's everyone else doing? Are they seeing this, and what's happening? I'm
not sure what the competition's doing, but I just keep finding new ways to improve the technology, like things that are very obvious that I overlooked for 15 years. Time and phase. I mean, you have to make sure that everything's in time and phase in order to have a proper phase curve. And the Roxanne, when I was working on the Roxanne, I discovered that if I could put everything in time, the low, mid, and highs within 100th of a millisecond, that I had a perfectly flat phase response, which was what gives you the imaging, especially in the center image where there's no interaction. Any phase cancellation is going to take place where the center image works. But so I think the biggest thing, there's two things that I believe that have set Jerry Harvey Audio apart from everyone else is time phase, making sure everything's in correct time and phase, and then figuring out how to get the top end extension out of a balanced armature earpiece. It's really easy to get lows, mids. Getting any top end extension above 10K is the difficult part because of how balanced armatures work.
All right, so that's a good lead-in, I guess, for the next sort of set of questions. I'm curious about your thoughts on modern audio engineering. So lots of people here listen to Spotify or Google Music, things like this, and these are all compressed. So what does this do for you as a designer when you have to make products that people are using to listen to compressed audio that may be very different from what the pros are listening to?
I would never design a product that sounded good with low quality audio. So my basic concept for designing an audio product is to make it straight through plumbing, that you should get out of it exactly what you put into it, with varying degrees of bass response, because bass is like spice. Some people like bland food, some people like spicy food. So no one ever tells me, I really don't want, I don't want an accurate frequency response, but they always ask me how much bass does an earpiece have in it. So my concept is to make an earpiece that every time you make the audio signal better that the earpiece reproduces will ramp up with a higher quality audio signal. With nowadays you have these high resolution players like the Stel Kern players that are doing 192 files. They're doing DSD with dual DACs and killer headphone amps. So those players really shine with a good set of headphones or a good set of earpieces. And I will say that when you do have a really good set of headphones or earphones, when you play a low-res file, you hear a low-res file. So, I would never design anything to try to polish that up.
It sort of reminds me when CDs first came out, when they said there's a warning on a CD that says, warning, this may reveal weaknesses in the original recording because this is digital and it was recorded really poorly 10 years ago.
I think that's the beauty of the recordings, though. Some of those old analog recordings, even when you hear them remastered, they still sound analog and they sound amazing. I think listening to an old recording that's been remastered is still pretty cool. Listen to some of the songs in the 60s. I mean, they had such good melodies and such good hooks. I mean, you were listening to it, on an AM radio that had limited frequency response, but the song still rocked. Either it was a good song or it wasn't. So that's, I appreciate the old recordings, and I think that hearing it the way it was recorded back then, but in high res is really cool.
So I guess the last one is so JH traditionally is making professional IEMs, but the consumer market is enormous. So how do you market into that market? How do you break into that? How do you convince people who think that the iPod earphones that they get, how do you convince people there's something better?
I think because of Google and because of the way that the world works now, especially the internet, anybody that just puts in a better headphone is going to end up to one of the chat rooms, the headfi.org or something like that. So I think that people do their research, and by doing their research, they kind of stumble upon me or Ultimate Ears or one of the companies.
And so you mentioned that you're all the high-end products that the JH makes are all custom fit, except for the Roxanne, which you mentioned has a universal fit as well. So is the movement for consumer towards universal fit, I assume, because it's easier to sell, right?
People want instant gratification, but I think they also want higher quality audio out of the one-size-fits-all. The trend in Southeast Asia, which hasn't quite hit America yet, is that there's a few companies that were building high-end one-size-fits-all. They were also custom companies, but so the audio quality was increasing. It wasn't, the $200 to $300 mass-produced out of China earphones. They're selling things for, Shure just put out a new product, the 846, which is a good product for $1,200. And a company called Fidier, a Japanese company, has a product that's $1,500. That's one size fits all. It's not even custom. So when I saw that trend, for me, I always want to one-up everyone else in the marketplace. So I took my new product, Roxanne, and just made a universal fit out of it so I could kind of like one-up everyone. And it's amazing. It's an expensive product, but we can't build it fast enough in the one-size-fits-all. So I think that anybody that appreciates audio, and if they get what they pay for, is looking for, if they want a good product it's available now. Before that option wasn't available.
And are you selling the universal fits in stores, or are they still only sold through directly?
The universal fits are only sold through our dealers. So like Julie's one of our dealers in New York, she sells them, and then we have dealers all across the country. We'll have like Earphone Solutions. There's a couple other companies out there that'll start selling them here pretty soon. But So those aren't sold direct at the present time. They're all sold through our dealers, and they'll be listed on the website shortly. We just launched it.
Does anyone have any questions about audio engineering, about rock stars, about anything? So please come to the mic if you want to talk.
Hey, thanks for coming today. I have a set of triple 510s there.
Oh,
amazing.
cool.
But I was just curious about the trend that music is taking now with, I guess, recorded music becoming more compressed in general, and how you're taking that into account with how you design headphones, where you have like an even response in your earpieces, but the music itself may not be up to par for that, for what people are starting to listen to. So I was just curious how you're handling that.
Well, I think I'll touch on it. It's like I don't change the way I build a product or tune a product for the lower compressed files, but I do think that what's happening is that people are becoming more aware of the high resolution files out on the internet. Like you have hdtracks.net, you have about a half dozen websites out there that you can actually download pretty much any album that you've ever loved in 192 that's been remastered, or not remastered, but at least 96K. So I think the trend, obviously, anybody that's listening to very compressed music is not an audiophile. They probably will be okay with a normal set of headphones.
Sorry, I guess my question is more how the bands themselves are recording.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I mean, you listen to some of these records that are mastered. They're mastered so they sound really loud. So that's just a preference of whoever the mix engineer is, whoever's doing the mastering. But I hope that trend of making things compressed and sounding, really kind of loud, kind of like I won't mention any bands, but that trend actually, reverses, and people are trying to get a more, analog sound out of it instead of that highly compressed sound. So that's what I mean, I'm not a recording engineer. I'm a live sound engineer. So I'm not really in tune with the recording process of what they're doing in the studios these days.
It's actually an interesting follow-up I had. So you're mixing what the band is hearing on stage, and there's a guy in the audience who's mixing what the audience is hearing. So what are the differences? What are the differences in how you mix for the band versus how they mix for the audience? Well,
I have to make the band happy, so it's kind of like Burger King, have it your way. It's like a service industry. I may not, there's a lot of people I've worked for that I would never get that sound on my own that they like to listen to while they're performing. So I basically interact with the band, and I please the band. And the front of house engineer, has to please the guitar player's girlfriend. He has to please the manager. So it's a totally different concept out front. It's more you're judged by a lot of other people and reviews in the newspaper. And for me, I get an instant review from the band. Either they like it or I don't. So it's kind of less pressure than being the guy out front that's totally under the microscope.
Is it common for the bands to want to listen, though, to what the audience is hearing so they know what they're experiencing?
Well, it's really funny. What they do, they always get a board tape at the end of the night. Now they have basically Pro Tools, so they can kind of do a quick mix. But the funny thing is now that the last Van Halen tour I did, Alex would come in with a cell phone and a YouTube clip and go, listen to what this sounds like. And we're like, well, we don't even know what part of the building that guy was sitting in, right? So it's, so some people, want to listen to the YouTube stuff and try to make it sound like Alex wants it to sound good and translate to that, that AM radio sounding cell phone. And then, other bands are just want to hear it, a full mix down of multi-track that's gone down to a CD at the end of the night so they can review if they're performing right or what it sounds like. But the only thing that you hear if you're a musician, unless you're going out in front of the PA, is all you're hearing is a bunch of slap off the back wall and low end coming off the PA. So you really have no idea what it sounds like in the front of house. You just have to trust the people that are out in front that are your people to give you a straight story of what it sounds like, right?
Yeah.
Thanks for coming in and talking to us. I'm sure there's a lot of engineers in the room. I was wondering if you could talk through some of the technical considerations you make in terms of designing your headphones. So I'm thinking about how you choose your crossovers. Is a flat frequency response, the ideal response? How you deal with phase issues if you have two bass drivers, for example. So if you could just talk through those a little bit.
Sure. First of all, I would never tune anything flat. I think flat's boring. kick drum shouldn't sound like a baseball hitting a mid, right? So, but that's my personal preference. So I always tune things with a little bit more bottom end. But as far as, like I said, when you're using I'll just speak to the phase first. When you're using multi-driver components, they all have different time signatures. Just like a PA system, the low frequencies are longer sound waves and high frequencies are much shorter. So in a PA system, if you look at it without any time correction, the highs are going to be early, the mids are going to be a little bit later, and the lows are going to be really slow. So what you do nowadays you don't have to do it, but what the DSP's done is they've basically delayed the mids, delayed the highs, so everything arrives at the same time, right? And then they put it in time with the subs. So that's kind of what I've done in the earpiece, but I've done a physical waveguide. So I discovered that we've got better software now because of the power of the PC. I can test, phase curves, and I can get within 100th of a millisecond on the impulse time of those little miniature drivers. So I found that as soon as I went within 100th of a millisecond, that the crossover points became perfect, where I actually had to change my crossover shapes because they became so efficient at the crossover points, and that the phase response basically became not perfectly flat, but no more than 10 degrees off of zero, which is unheard of in an in-ear monitor because they're pretty much up until that point were all out of phase, at either the crossover point, or some of the old drivers were just out of phase across the bandwidth just internally, right? So that's the phase side of it. The other big obstacle, as I mentioned earlier, is high frequency response. So when I design, like this new piece, the Roxanne, when the first in-ear monitor I designed, I got it to, the high frequency extension rolled off at 8K, and there was no way that we could get it to go out any further. And that's because the way that a balanced armature impedance curve works. So what happens is, as it goes up in frequency, the impedance rises. So, you may have 10 ohms at 1K, and you'll have 100 ohms at 20K. So what happens is the headphone amp doesn't see a load, and the high-end roll-off is inverse to the rise in the impedance curve. So it looks like a hockey stick, and it does the same thing. What I found is that if I can change the shape of the impedance curve, that I can actually get more high-frequency extension. So I designed the reason I use 4 drivers on the Roxanne is because I could actually tune those coils. If you do DC from 10 hertz to 20K, the thing will measure a half ohm. But as soon as you high pass it out to 4K, it measures 20 ohms right there. So what I ended up doing was, by having 4 components, I could wire them all in parallel, high pass them, and have the headphone amp see a load at 20K, which is why the Roxanne's the first earpiece I've ever got that will go out past 20K before and still have usable information, not down 12 or 14 dB or something like that. So that's the biggest time. And then as far as the audio response, I never tune anything flat. I tune it accurate. So if you were to see it on an FFT analyzer, you get out of it exactly what you put into it. I kind of shape the top end roll off where I think it's pleasing, and then I set the bass response. So like the new piece, like I said, every day I answer the question, how much bass does a particular model have? So with the new piece I designed, I put attenuators on the bass driver so you can set it 0 to plus 15, so you can basically set the bass where you like it. So kind of preempted the conversation there. So did that answer any of your questions?
Yeah, no, very
Okay.
Hi, I'm actually a live engineer, so I've got a question sort of from that side of the fence.
Okay.
In terms of modern front of house systems and even dynamic driver monitor systems these days, DSP, like you sort of mentioned, is a really big thing. So do you see that sort of coming to the in-ear market in terms of things like customizability? So the bass response, the high-end response, whatever, changing it to sort of that person's taste, even in the consumer market where you don't have a monitor guy to sort of boost your top end or whatever?
I see that coming in the near future. I built a 3-way amplifier a couple years ago called the 3A. So it didn't give the user the interface that I wanted it to because, there's 3 amps in there. But I do believe that DSP, equalization, and control of the circuit for an end user is really close. I think the bottom end control on the Roxanne is just the starting point. So what's going to if you look at that earpiece, I actually took the passive crossover circuit. There's 4 pins at the earpiece, so you have ground, low, mid, and high. So my idea is that you could actually put an attenuator on any band and just do a broad low, mid, and high adjustment if you liked. I'm kind of doing an open market to the cable manufacturers aftermarket. And also, I think that the only way that we're going to get any more out of an in-ear monitor with the current technology is going to be control-based. So that's been on my roadmap for quite a while. But what I think that really needs to happen is I think that giving the end user the control over being able to set the shape of the equalization, turn to kind of mess around with the crossover. I mean, that's what I would like, So some people that may be above their skill set, it might need to be a little simpler, but I think at the end of the day that's not too far off.
Great. Thank you. That's awesome.
Is that control the kind of thing that you think will move into your other models? So you think that other, besides the Roxanne, will let you adjust the bass and so on? Yeah,
I think that that's going to be an ongoing trend, and just giving the end user more control over the audio signature.
I guess it's interesting also for the consumer market. So some people like listening to rap, some people listen to rock, and they have different opinions of how much bass there should be and how much treble there should be.
Yeah, so that's why I kind of set the Roxanne that way. So if you want heavy bass, it'll shake your fillings out. If you want flat,
who needs fillings?
Yeah, who needs fillings? Yeah.
Any other questions?
Overrated.
Cool.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate
Thanks again,
it.
Jerry.
Thanks for coming.